You expect a simple story: rain, rising rivers, a map with a blue smear and the phrase, "the flood." But beneath that neat summary lies a tangle of ruined harbors, drowned hearths, shattered memories, and voices from long before our calendars began, voices that whisper that what we call the flood was not one event neatly boxed in a ledger, but a tapestry of local calamities, epic migrations, and human choices woven across a single, turbulent century. Picture a coastline you know now as a quiet bay. Imagine at its edge a wooden platform, the echo of a drum, and someone tightening a rope around the child's wrist because the shoreline itself has become an argument: who stays and who goes. We promise big revelations in this hour, surprising geological turns, fresh readings of ancient myths, and provocative new theories that refuse to agree. We will look at sediment and stone, at pottery shards and place names, at bones and boats, and at the way stories became rituals. If you lean in, we'll also admit what we don't know, because the mystery is the point. We are not here to tell you a single, tidy answer. We are here to open the ledger, to show you the marginalia, to leave you standing at those sun-bleached docks where the future of entire peoples hung in the balance. You and I will move from the hush of a museum gallery into the raw wind on a cliff. We will track footprints in soft silt, and count the rings of trees that died in a single winter. That contrast, between the expectation of a single, explaining headline and the reverberating local mysteries, is where the story lives. Begin by imagining time in a way that doesn't obey our tidy decades and centuries but pulses in seasons and harvests, and the memory passed from a grandmother to a child through a single line in a chant. 12,000 years ago, around 10,000 BC by our conventional reckoning, the world was shifting in ways both gradual and catastrophic. Ice sheets that had held vast inland seas were retreating. Sea levels were rising, yes, but they did so by fits and starts, by sudden pulses when an ice dam broke or a meltwater lake found a new path. Trade routes, if we call them that, were lines drawn in the mud of riverbanks where salt and fresh water met, and fishermen met strangers with new shells and new words. Some cultures of that long-ago world practiced mobility as a religion. They chose to follow herds and currents rather than anchor themselves to one place. Others had built surprisingly complex settlements, timber platforms on marshes, stone-lined storage pits, and burial rites that suggest stable, intergenerational communities. When water came, it did not arrive as a single, cinematic tidal wall that washes over all human life at once. It came as a series of stresses: rising tides swallowing farms, fresh water sources turning brackish, storms that no living memory could survive. And with each stress, people did what humans always have: adapted, migrated, worshipped, and sometimes failed. But here's where it gets tricky. The archaeological record is stubbornly local while our thirst for a global narrative is universal. A submerged village off one coast might leave a perfect wooden plank preserved in anaerobic mud. Inland, a hearth might be found above a silt layer that tells of sudden flooding. Elsewhere, a mythic tale, an origin story about a great cleansing, might be recorded not in words but in the arrangement of graves, in the way a culture buries its leaders facing a vanished sea. Still, for all the evidence we can display under museum lights, much is equivocal. Radiocarbon dates disagree by centuries. Geological layers shift subtly depending on an estuary's currents. A skeleton may appear to have been displaced by water, or the disarticulation might be the work of scavengers long after the fact. Now, let's be fair, the people of 12,000 years ago left no newspapers, but they left a million small decisions carved into earth and bone. To make sense of those choices, we must be forensic and generous at once, skeptical of simple cause and effect, but open to mythic resonance. Picture yourself standing at the remains of a timber quay, fog clinging to the fields, thinking about the child who tucked a carved bead under a pillow the night the river first spilled its banks. The bead is a clue, both intimate and silent. It asks us what survival looked like then, and how the stories of that night were later shaped into epic warnings and promises. One of the first things we discover, when we try to stitch the global story of the flood together, is that different places remember different catastrophes. The Black Sea remembers a pulse, the sudden influx of seawater into a freshwater basin that some researchers argue happened around 7,600 years ago, long after our 12,000-year mark. Yet there are clear analogues: meltwater lakes that catastrophically drained, coastal shelves that drowned as the ocean rose, and storm surges that permanently altered estuaries. All of these created moments when established lifeways were rendered precarious. The question is not whether flooding happened, that is a given, but whether it happened in a way that could be remembered across generations as a singular, mythic event. Was there a domino effect? One region destabilized, its people moved, they clashed with others, and stories of a great flood propagated as both memory and metaphor? Or were there many localized floods, each traumatic in its own way, that were later conflated through trade networks and oral traditions into a single, sweeping myth? The evidence nudges both ways. Now, let us turn to how science attempts to read this layered archive. Paleoclimatologists study pollen trapped in peat and lake cores, reading the story of forests that turned to marsh and then to open water. Geologists look for tsunami deposits, distinct layers of sand and shell pushed inland by violent waves. Archaeologists search for abrupt abandonment patterns, houses left with pots still on the hearth, children's toys neglected on a floor. Geneticists examine ancient DNA to trace migrations. When a community leaves a homeland, descendants might carry markers that travel with them. Each of these methods is powerful, but each also carries uncertainty. A wave deposit can be misread as a storm or vice versa. A sudden stop in settlement might be due to disease, conflict, resource exhaustion, or water. We sit at a crossroads of possibility, and that is exactly where the story becomes compelling. Our conclusions must always be provisional, tentative maps of an ever-shifting landscape. When we speak of the Great Flood, we must also speak of the human imagination that made meaning from catastrophe. Around kitchen fires and within early sanctuaries, people told stories to bind a narrative around what seemed like chaotic chance. Flood myths appear in near-universal form across cultures: a storm that drives the gods to anger, a candle that lights the survivor's newborn world, an ark or refuge that preserves a remnant. The mythic element, the giants, the lost tribes, the accursed stones, is not mere decoration. It is part of how communities endured memory's burden. It turns trauma into a narrative that can be rehearsed, transmitted, and ritualized. When you hear a story about a city swallowed by water with only a single survivor to recount it, what you are hearing is not a literal documentary record but a carefully chosen package of meaning. That package shaped behavior. It told people not just what had happened, but what to do next. So, pull your coat tighter and imagine the first mystery we'll examine in depth: a coastal settlement whose wooden pilings and fishhooks tell a story of sudden abandonment, a place where the very architecture suggests adaptation to rising tides. Picture a community that fished at low tide and stored grain on raised platforms at the first sign of high water. Think of the soundscape: boats creaking, nets being mended, drums echoing through the night to mark the fishing hours, and then silence, followed by the strange, hollow wail of a wind that had never been heard before. As you walk those foggy trails at dawn, you will feel the tang of sea salt and the ache of displacement. We still don't know. A single-sentence teaser: on a drowned shelf of what is now a shallow sea, an entire harbor community left behind timbers, anchors, and a story that refuses to stay buried. The site, let's call it the Harbor of Bones for the moment, is dated by radiocarbon measures of the timbers and of tool handles found in situ. The dates cluster around a narrow window that, when calibrated, sits roughly at the broad era we are calling the Great Flood, between about 11,500 and 10,500 years before present. The community's scale is startling. Wooden wharves extend for hundreds of meters along what would have been a protective inlet. Storage pits are lined with stone and sealed with organic matter preserved in the anoxic mud. These pits held grains, tubers, and dried fish. Tools found nearby, net weights, bone hooks, and carved toggles, speak to a sophisticated maritime niche economy, seasonal fishing, shell trade, and perhaps even long-distance exchange of obsidian and salt. Measurements of artifact distribution suggest quartered neighborhoods and areas that functioned as market spaces. In short, this was not a temporary camp. It was a place of habit and investment. Key discoveries at the Harbor of Bones trouble any tidy explanation. First, the timbers show repetitive maintenance. Many were repaired with Bronze Age-style pegging techniques centuries before bronze, and the same craftsmen left marks that indicate knowledge passed across multiple generations. Second, there are traces of diet that shift abruptly in the layers, a stable terrestrial diet that becomes marine-heavy in a matter of a few years. Third, isotopic analyses on human remains, where available, suggest that some individuals were born inland and later moved to the coast, while others show lifelong coastal diets. This pattern speaks to a mixed community. Locals adapted to the sea while newcomers brought different practices. Trade route inferences from exotic shells indicate connections to islands hundreds of kilometers away. Picture a network of canoes carrying people and stories across an uncertain seascape. Now, for the competing theories. Theory 1 is environmental determinism. The Harbor of Bones was abandoned because rising sea levels gradually converted the inlet into open ocean and made harboring boats impossible. Under this view, the community tried to adapt, raised platforms, new wharves, but the rate of change outpaced their engineering. Theory 2 suggests a catastrophic pulse. A sudden inundation from a meltwater outburst or a mega tsunami smashed the harbor and made it unusable almost overnight. Evidence that supports this includes abrupt sand layers mixed with shell in places where you'd expect silt. Theory 3 throws human agency into the center: conflict and migration. A pressure from inland groups driven by drought or newly mobile herds could have forced coastal peoples to flee, or the harbor might have been raided and then abandoned. The cultural markers, weapon damage on timbers, burned hearths, can be read this way. Now, let's be fair, each theory explains part of the record. The environmental model fits long-term shifts in pollen and salinity. The catastrophic model fits some abrupt geological layers. The human agency model accounts for certain artifact patterns. Still, for all the evidence, we cannot yet privilege one explanation without stretching the data. Adding to the drama, local myths recorded millennia later by descendant communities speak of the sea that swallowed the sugar fields, and of giant oarsmen, who came from the horizon. Those phrases, giant oarsmen, swallowed fields, are equal parts metaphor and encoded memory. They tell of outsiders both feared and revered and of land transformed into an enemy. When oral tradition describes giants, archaeologists sometimes see exaggerated memories of ships with large crews or tall voyagers from different climates. Other times, the giants might be literalized in burial contexts, skeletons of unusually large individuals, perhaps members of different populations, interred with distinctive grave goods. The mythic element lends color and caution. These are the story forms that help survivors teach their children what to avoid, whom to trust, and how to read the sea's moods. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn along that ancient inlet, the mud sucking at your boots, the wreck of a wooden hull half buried like a crocodile's back. Imagine the smell, a mix of brine, rotted tar, and the faintly sharp tang of starved beasts. You can see the scaffolding where other worlds once met. You can almost hear, if you let your mind fill in the silence, the hum of many voices bargaining for fish and trade. We still don't know whether that last night ended in a single, violent crescendo or in a long, weary retreat. We are left with timbers and beads and a myth that grew in their absence. Moving inland now, consider a different kind of site, a river valley where entire layers of settlement sit under a thick pall of silt. One-sentence teaser. In the braided rivers of an inland valley, entire neighborhoods were smothered in silt as if the land had been exhaled and then drowned, leaving behind pottery and skeletons in silent rows. The valley reveals a different scale and pattern. Here the indicators point less to sea level rise than to catastrophic flood pulses, rivers overwhelmed by meltwater surges, sudden course changes, and bank collapses. The settlements here are often organized on terraces, with houses built of wattle and daub or sod. Measurements show the terraces aligned to ancient river lines, and the pottery styles indicate a continuity of craft tradition for centuries before the event. Key discoveries include mass deposition layers, fine sediments that contain household items, and even human remains in what looks like hurried burial rather than ceremonial interment. Soil chemistry shows a sudden shift from organic-rich topsoil to mineral-laden deposits. There are also tools embedded in positions that suggest people tried to hold things in place. A grinding stone toppled mid-use. A weaving loom still laced with thread. The social clues are powerful. These were communities tied to the river's rhythm, with storage pits and granaries implying food surpluses and social institutions capable of managing resources. They were not fragile bands but organized societies with investment in place. Competing theories again multiply. One theory claims the floods were climatic, an unusual warming pulse that sent meltwater racing down from highlands, slicing new channels and filling lowlands. Another hypothesis suggests human-triggered change. Heavy deforestation for fuel or agriculture increased erosion, making riverbanks collapse more easily under heavy rains. A third, more sensational theory proposes tectonic influence, an earthquake that shifted riverbeds or dam tributaries until the sudden release caused a dam break flood. Each theory fits parts of the data. For example, tree ring sequences from upstream show years of heavy precipitation. Pollen analysis indicates a decline in forest cover contemporaneous with the deposit layers. Still, for all the evidence, we cannot conclusively say which mechanism dominated. There may be an interplay among them, climate stress that was exacerbated by human alteration and unleashed by tectonic shifts. The mythic overlay here is striking. Stories from later oral traditions describe the river that walked like a beast, and the day the sky's mouth opened. Some accounts speak of towns swallowed whole and of stone watchers, left standing to warn future generations. These are vivid metaphors, yes, but they also encode behavioral norms. Do not build too close to the river, keep grain on high floors, respect the elders who still remember how to read the current. Picture yourself on the river terrace at dawn, mud-damp reeds bending in a breathless wind. You might imagine someone dragging a child from a flooding doorway, the child's small hands leaving prints in the wet clay. We still don't know whether those prints belong to fugitives from war or refugees of water, or what the long-term population consequences were. As the day darkens in our narrative, let us take another mystery, a coastal lagoon where stone structures now sit half-submerged and aligned like a giant, measured calendar. One-sentence teaser, at a salt-sweet lagoon, precisely placed standing stones hint at ritual responses to rising water and the creation of new sanctuaries. The site is remarkable for its intentionality. Stones, carefully dressed and positioned, create sight lines over the lagoon's mouth. Terraces cut into the shoreline suggest deliberate landscaping. Small watch huts placed on promontories indicate observation and possibly ritual performance. Radiocarbon dates on charcoal beneath the stones match our broader time frame. This site reveals social choices more than pure accident. Did communities build sanctuaries to placate the spirits they believed controlled water? Did elites stage performances to assert control during times of stress? Or were these simply pragmatic watchpoints to warn of incoming surges? Key discoveries complicate the picture. Offerings, shells, carved figurines, and traces of pigments point to ritual. Yet there are also simple artifacts, repaired boats, rope fragments, and a concentration of spear points. The data allow us to imagine a society that blended ritual with practical maritime knowledge. Competing theories here include ritual adaptation, using symbolic architecture to manage communal anxiety and to coordinate responses to seasonal floods. Another proposes that these structures were part of a proto-maritime authority, an emergent class whose power depended on controlling access to boats and food stores. A third, more speculative idea links the alignment of stones to astronomical events, high tides coinciding with certain star risings, making the site a calendrical tool to schedule fishing and planting. Again, the evidence fits multiple stories, and we must hold them in tension. The mythic overlay here is luminous. Accounts of stone watchers and the Great Chorus suggest that water became a divine interlocutor, something to be negotiated with through ritual and song. Picture yourself walking along the stones at dawn, mist rising from the lagoon and a lone figure beating a drum to mark the tide's approach. We still don't know whether the alignment is scientific, political, or ceremonial, or whether it was all three at once. Move with me now from the low, brackish lagoons and river terraces to the hard, glittering evidence of ice itself, those scoured channels and stranded boulders that can only be carved by moving water with the force of mountains. Picture a highland lake hidden behind a natural dam of ice and moraine, fed by glaciers that have been loosening their grip for generations. For a long time that lake was an ordinary thing in a cold world, a mirror that gathered melt and light, a place where fish migrated and where people came to harvest reeds and lay stones for ritual offerings. Then, in one violent season, the dam failed, or perhaps it was undermined slowly until the last weak seam gave. The result, a roaring outburst flood that tore down ancient valleys, chewed the banks into terraces, and carved coulees so deep you could stand inside them and not see the rim. The one-sentence truth at the heart of this place is simple. A trapped lake found its exit, and the land paid with long channels and bony, stripped bedrock. This is a story that leaves marks that are geological rather than domestic, but those marks intersect with human life in ways that are visceral and immediate. When we study these scoured channels, big, U-shaped scars in the terrain, with erratic boulders left as if someone had flung them, the dates we get from organic matter trapped in the layers are telling. Charcoal from fires on terraces above the channel yields radiocarbon readings that place human presence right up to the moment of incision. Tree ring sequences recovered from buried stumps show a pattern, a century of erratic growth, then a final year of narrow rings suggesting drought or heat, followed quickly by the flood deposits. The scale is staggering. The volumes of water hypothesized to have flowed through these channels are measured in thousands of cubic kilometers. The erosive power could have swept away entire woodlands and rearranged river networks downstream for centuries. People living in those valleys were not merely inconvenienced, their world was re-engineered. Sites that had been unarable terraces were stripped down to bedrock or buried under tens of meters of sediment. Storage pits and communal ovens disappeared beneath new deposits. In certain places, archaeologists have found human remains in positions that indicate sudden displacement. Skeletons that seem to have been swept and buried, bones oriented downstream, artifacts scattered in patterns inconsistent with deliberate burial. Three main camps of explanation contend to account for these megafloods. The first is the classic glacial outburst model. Ice-dammed lakes, sometimes enormous, sometimes modest, burst through when the ice melted or when a wave generated by a landslide overtopped the dam. This model is supported by geological analogs found in more recent centuries and by the presence of moraines and ice scour patterns upstream. The second model emphasizes climatic volatility. Rapid warming episodes created pulses of meltwater that overwhelmed natural drainage. Under this view, the floods are not a single sudden event but a series of powerful surges that, cumulatively, rework the landscape. The third, and more speculative, theory suggests that a tectonic event, a sudden uplift or earthquake, rearranged a watershed so that stored water found a new, catastrophic path. Tectonic theory is sometimes invoked where the geomorphology doesn't neatly fit an ice dam breach, or where downstream deposits include materials that indicate landslides or uplift. Each account is persuasive in different settings, and sometimes the real answer is a compound one. A tectonic nudge destabilizes an ice dam already weakened by rapid warming, while a coastal tsunami waits at the river's mouth to complicate recovery. We also have cultural traces that complicate the picture in crucial ways. In some upstream valleys, after the flood scoured the floors, we find evidence that people returned to the newly raw ground and created ritual caches, small built features with carefully placed artifacts that seem to commemorate the violent reshaping of the world. These caches include beads, polished stone blades, and the occasional figurine, placed as if to mark both loss and renewal. Why perform such rituals in newly exposed bedrock? One interpretation reads them as offerings to the forces that had just remade the land, an act of bargaining aimed at spirits of water or ice. Another reads them as claims, a way for survivors to assert ownership over newly exposed land and to ritualize the transfer of memory into a durable, material form. Either way, the human response to geomorphology is not merely adaptive, it is profoundly narrative-making. Now, picture yourself walking the great coulee at dawn, the wind whistles in a bare, stony throat, and you pass slabs polished by torrents, gulls will far below, and the echo of your footsteps returns like a throat clearing. Imagine an elder pointing out a groove carved into a boulder and saying, "We were here before the great throat opened." In that groove, you might see scratches left by stone tools, small human marks that insist people were not incidental to the landscape. They were protagonists in it. We still don't know exactly which combination of forces, ice, climate, quake, opened each throat, nor can we reliably tell whether such megafloods were rare, once-in-a-millennium events or clustered in deadly centuries. The geological clock is patient but ambiguous, and human memory, passed orally, stretches and condenses in ways the rocks cannot. Shift with me now to an island world that once stood proud above a shallow sea, an archipelago of reed-thatched huts and stone-lined mounds where people practiced a hybrid economy of fishing, seaweed gathering, and limited horticulture. One-sentence teaser: an island chain, once vibrant with reef fishing tribes and salt traders, slid under the tide and left behind stone circles and the occasional giant skeleton in peat, reminders of drowned life. On these islands the archaeological record is intimate. Layers of peat contain preserved wooden artifacts, woven nets, and even fragments of textiles that owe their survival to anoxic conditions. Standing stones and small cairns suggest places of gathering and ceremony. The scale here is human and the evidence visceral. Shell middens piled like miniature mountains and hearths filled with charcoal still smelling faintly of old meals. Radiocarbon dates cluster around our target period, and isotopic data on marine shells suggest a reliance on rich, localized resources that would have made these islands hubs for coastal exchange networks. Several strands of interpretation have been proposed to explain the island's demise. The first is incremental inundation. As sea level rose, low-lying islets lost arable ground and fresh water, and communities gradually migrated to higher ground or abandoned maritime subsistence in favor of inland strategies. Under this scenario, the disappearance is a slow attrition rather than a single dramatic event. The second scenario posits episodic catastrophes, storm surges and typhoons that physically breached dunes and rewrote shorelines in a single night. In that model, the last population may have been wiped out by a particularly violent storm season that occurred when sea levels were already high. The third theory brings in human factors, resource depletion, overharvesting of reefs, or social conflict that undermined resilience in the face of rising sea. There are even more dramatic hypotheses that suggest submarine landslides or localized tsunamis, events that could have produced sudden, catastrophic inundation. But direct evidence for such slides in every case remains elusive. The mythic response to island drowning is striking and often lyrical. Stories collected from coastal peoples many generations later speak of the reed people who walked into the sea with their boats like a cloud, or of sleeping stones that rose from the deep to take back the islands. In some oral versions there are references to unusually tall people, giants, who stood as guardians on shore and then vanished under the waves. Skeptical readers might see the giants as symbolic exaggeration. Others point to the occasional discovery of skeletons larger than local averages, skeletal remains that could indicate genetic differences between island populations and their inland neighbors. Whether literal or metaphorical, the giant motif seems to encode the awe inspired by superior seafaring skills, or perhaps the memory of different peoples meeting in trade and conflict. Picture yourself standing barefoot on a peat flat at sunrise, a single battered post stuck in the mud like a lonely sentinel. Imagine the hush of a place emptied of its makers, the gulls the only audience left, and the shore littered with beads and knives, each a small, personal testament. We still don't know whether the islands were erased by patient sea level rise, by sudden storms, or by a confluence of ecological and social breakdowns that made life untenable. Each of these stories, the harbor swallowed, the river terraces buried, the stones aligned at a lagoon, the coulees carved by megafloods, the islands drowned, offers a different angle on what the flood could mean. Some are local and practical, some are epic and mythic. All of them resist the comforting neatness of a single, universal explanation. That resistance is not a problem to be overcome but the very center of the mystery. It is a mirror that reflects human variability. People respond to water in myriad ways, build higher, move inland, argue over the last good spring, sing to the river, or bury talismans under new stones. And in every response we find choices that illuminate social structure: who led the rebuilding, who was allowed to take the boats, who stayed behind to guard the sacred things. These are the sorts of details that transform a geological event into a human saga. But the mystery does not end with the archaeological and geological clues. There is another layer, one that the scribes of later societies turned into canonical myths and holy warnings. Around campfires and in early temples, the image of deluge became a moral instrument, a lesson about hubris, a covenant between humans and the unseen powers of the world. Why does a mythic flood so often carry the theme of moral purification? Because stories perform work. They compress complex, multi-causal events into memorable packages, and then they bind morals to those packages so that survival strategies are transmitted as social law. It is no accident that some flood myths depict a chosen remnant, an individual or family rescued by cunning or righteousness. Those stories prescribe behavior, preserve the seed, maintain the vessel, listen to the elders. At other moments, the flood myth becomes an origin story, a way for a people to claim a fresh start on newly exposed land. We came here after the waters receded, a community says, and in saying so they define themselves as inheritors of renewal. Picture again, for a moment, a quiet shore at dawn. You walk between half-buried posts and find a small pouch of beads, still bright after millennia. You expect to be clever and scientific, to catalog and carbon date and fit the beads into patterns of trade. But then you feel the human tug. Someone long dead chose those beads for reasons that were not merely decorative. They may have been charms against drowning or tokens for the future spouse. You cannot prove which, but you can notice that the choice matters. The artifacts turn into evidence not only of economic systems but of meaning, how people tried to make sense of catastrophe in real time. There are other, darker possibilities that friends of dramatic flair sometimes whisper about: cometary fragments striking the atmosphere and dumping energy in the form of heat and waves, a mysterious, impact winter, followed by abrupt melt, or a sequence of cosmic events that caught human systems off guard. These ideas have been floated in scientific literature and public imagination alike, often because they stitch together global anomalies, abrupt climate shifts registered in Greenland ice cores, biological turnovers, and synchronous cultural disruptions. Yet such cosmic explanations carry heavy evidentiary burdens. They must account for a wide range of local patterns without overreaching the data. The honest posture is humility: consider the cosmic, but always bring it back down to the sediment, the hearth, the bead. The more attractive the grand hypothesis, the more careful we must be in testing it against local truths. And so we return to our starting point, the tension between a human yearning for a single, unified story and the mosaic of local experiences the earth preserves. We are telling a story about a flood that was many floods, a story that is sometimes violent, sometimes patient, sometimes social, sometimes climatic. Our job is to attend to both the stone and the story, to the radiocarbon dates and the lullabies mothers sang about the night the river growled. There is no shame in uncertainty. Indeed, it is the most honest position. Each dagger of evidence, each shard, each ring in a tree, each oral fragment, sharpens the silhouette of the past, but it will not, and should not, reduce it to a single headline. We still don't know, fully, how to stitch every thread into a single fabric. What we do know is that the great watery disruptions of 12,000 years ago reshaped coastlines, economies, and human imaginations. They forced innovation, raised floor architecture, sacrificial caches, maritime calendars, and they birthed myths that have lasted thousands of years. They also taught hard lessons about vulnerability and resilience, and the importance of small rituals that organize large-scale cooperation. Picture yourself, once more, at the edge of any of these sites: standing stones, scoured coulees, submerged harbors, and listen. The wind is the voice of all those who lived through the water's wrath. The artifacts are syllables in a language we are still learning to read. Keep asking questions, keep treading lightly on the newly exposed bedrock. We still don't know. Picture now a broad plateau rimmed by salt flats where, beneath a thin crust of crystalline salt, lie the stone foundations of canals and terraces, evidence that once, people bent the land to water rather than the other way around. One sentence teaser: on a high plain rimmed with salt, stone-lined canals and sunken fields speak of an irrigation culture that vanished when water itself turned traitor. This place asks us to consider water not only as an external force but as a resource that societies actively managed. Its disappearance was therefore both environmental and social. The canals are measured and straight, cut with labor-intensive precision, and joined to what seem to have been storage basins that regulated seasonal flows. Measurements of the terraces show a sophisticated gradient system, the kind of engineering that implies central planning, a knowledge tradition eroded by time but once powerful enough to move Earth and time the flow of life through a year. Radiocarbon dates on reed matting and the occasional wooden gate place occupation firmly within our target epoch. People were living here, irrigating crops, and maintaining hydraulic infrastructure when something changed. Key discoveries at the plateau are the human signatures left in the channels, where patterns on sluice stones that indicate repeated opening and closing, small votive deposits at canal junctions, shells tied with plant fiber, a stone figurine tucked into a weir, as if water engineering and ritual belonged to the same craft. Soil chemistry shows a sudden shift from fresh, cultivated topsoil to layers of saline efflorescence, as if groundwater rose and left a bitter crust in place of sweet loam. There are also human remains buried near the basins, some in formal graves, others in hurried inhumations that suggest panic or epidemic. The social clues are wrenching. A community that had poured labor into landscape making suddenly found the water they depended on transformed into an enemy. Was this due to sea level intrusion up subterranean pathways, or due to groundwater salinization after a shift in rainfall patterns? Perhaps a tectonic activity subtly changed the aquifer dynamics so that wells that once gave sweet water now brought salt. Each of these hypotheses fits parts of the record. Isotope ratios in plant remains show a progressive uptake of salts concurrent with the soil change. Local pollen records indicate a reduction in upland forest cover which might have altered recharge patterns, and geological surveys hint at minor uplift events that could have rerouted subterranean flows. Competing interpretations divide along interesting lines. One camp argues that long-term aridification, slow climate change, reduced the yearly recharge of the aquifer until salt accumulated and crops failed, a steady attrition that sapped social cohesion. Another emphasizes abrupt pulses, a rare but extreme drought year followed by an unusually wet season that flushed salts into the system, leaving a lasting chemical alteration. Yet a third perspective brings politics to the fore. When water becomes scarce, elites who controlled sluices and storages could enforce unequal measures, rationing, forced migration, or punitive relocations that accelerated collapse. In places where we find evidence of sudden abandonment alongside hoarded food stores, the political explanation gains traction. Each model helps us see different human faces behind the geology: patient farmers watching the wells go bitter, priests walking to the headgate with offerings, families deciding which children to take and which to leave. The mythic overlay here includes tales of the plain whose wells turned to glass, and the man who traded his children for sweet water. These imagistic narratives carry moral and practical weight: conserve, share, plan, or suffer the moral cost of scarcity. Picture yourself standing at the cracked lip of a basin, salt crystals crunching underfoot, the air like an open furnace. Imagine an elder pressing a knuckle into the soil and saying, "We dug our life and then the life turned back." We still don't know whether the plateau's fall was 1,000 small betrayals of environment and policy or a single, horrible turning point that made the fields unlivable in a generation. Turn with me now to a site that pulses with the energy of trade and the ache of rupture, an estuary that once linked inland caravans to ocean-going canoes, its margins dotted with storage houses, way stations, and the tombs of merchants whose wealth depended on safe passage. One sentence teaser: at an ancient estuarine crossroads, amphorae, beads, and the bones of pack animals tell of a bustling exchange network that unraveled when coasts and rivers no longer agreed on the border between land and sea. The scale here is regional and economic. Measurements of storage pit capacities suggest that this estuary supported surplus trade in dried fish, salt, and a prized type of grass used for cordage, goods that traveled both up river valleys and out to islands. Faunal remains show a diet that combined riverine fish and oceanic species, evidence of a community adept at crossing ecological boundaries. Key discoveries include amphorae or their local equivalents, ceramic jars stamped with markings that indicate production centers, found alongside exotic stones and beads from distant shores. Isotopic maps of shellfish layers can trace seasons of harvest and suggest calendars of exchange. When the deposits shift from orderly layers to chaotic mixes of broken storage jars and hurried hearths, archaeologists infer sudden crisis. Some skeletons show marks of conflict, while others bear signs of malnutrition. Environmental data show rising salinities in river sediments and an increase in storm surge deposits near inland way stations that used to be safely above normal high water. The social consequences were dramatic. Caravans that once passed through safe estuarine channels became hazardous. Inland communities lost access to salt, a preservative vital to their food economy, and coastal traders faced ruined infrastructure. Several theories explain the unraveling. One argues for coastal transgression. As sea level rose, the estuary drowned inland, rendering ports unusable and forcing trade routes to reorient. Another theory emphasizes episodic storms that deposited barrier sands and cut off channels, turning lively estuaries into clogged marsh. A third focuses on human decisions, perhaps overexploitation of resources, overfishing, mangrove cutting, reduced the estuary's resilience, making it more vulnerable to smaller changes. A political twist suggests warfare over dwindling access points. Control of a remaining freshwater spring or a narrow channel could have sparked violence that closed the trade network permanently. The mythic register here tells of the merchants who barter souls, and the night the bridges were drowned. Phrases that sound theatrical but function as memory keepers, warning future generations about the fragility of supply lines. Picture yourself walking the silted streets of a former way station at dusk, your fingers brushing the rim of a broken jar stamped with a city's mark. Imagine the hush of a place where the echo of goods moving has turned to the creak of abandoned wagons. We still don't know whether the estuary's death was an ecological inevitability or a consequence of choices that could have been different. Throughout these segments, one thread runs clear: local specifics matter. The evidence insists we do not treat the Great Flood as a single slider on a map but as a constellation of events: floods, droughts, megafloods, salt intrusions, storms, and human conflict, that together reshaped the early Holocene world. But there is another dimension that makes the puzzle cosmic: the migration of stories themselves. Myths of flood, Noah and the Ark, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Deucalion in Greek tradition, and versions across indigenous cultures from the Americas to Australia share motifs so persistent that scholars ask whether they stem from a shared memory of cataclysm or from convergent narrative evolution. Humans everywhere respond to water's danger in similar metaphors. The archaeological patterns we observe, sudden abandonments, ritual caches, raised architecture, often find their closest analogues in these tales. They do not map neatly onto one another, but their resonance is more than coincidence. It is testimony to the human mind's way of making catastrophe legible. In some places, the myth travels along with people. Genetic studies show pulses of migration in the early Holocene. Small groups move, intermarry, and carry not only genes but stories, rites, and technologies. When a community flees a flooded plain and joins neighbors upriver, they do not leave their narrative behind. The tale of the drowned fields may be woven into the receiving culture's oral fabric, where it transforms and adapts. Conversely, the same catastrophe can produce divergent stories. One group emphasizes punishment by gods, another frames the flood as a test of cunning. When we listen carefully to these variations, we hear social values embedded in memory, accounts that tell us what communities prize and fear. But there are also technological aftershocks to consider. Water crises forced innovation: raised platform houses, stilted granaries, salt-tolerant crops, and devolved storage practices all spread as adaptive strategies. Engineering knowledge, how to build a durable quay, how to read sandbars, diffused along trade networks, becoming a form of cultural capital. Sometimes this knowledge hardened into institutions, priest engineers who timed planting with celestial alignments, or water councils who regulated sluices and punished hoarding. In other contexts, adaptive knowledge was lost as communities scattered, creating gaps we see in the archaeological record. Those lost skills sometimes re-emerged centuries later, reinvented in response to renewed pressure. Picture a village rebuilding on a slightly higher terrace. Their elders teach the children the old songs that encode the timing of tides. The children sing, and through song the knowledge survives. We still don't know how much of our modern water sense is a direct descendant of those survival strategies, and how much is the product of later, independent invention. Before we move toward a conclusion, allow me to trace one more strand: the toll on bodies and minds. Catastrophe is written not only in shards but in bones. Osteological analyses reveal patterns: healed fractures suggestive of past conflict, dental enamel hypoplasias indicating childhood stress, and isotopic shifts that show sudden dietary change. Mortuary treatment changes as well. In crisis, formal cemeteries may be abandoned in favor of hastier interments, or elites may be buried separately with items indicating retained status. Psychological echoes are harder to measure but not invisible. Rituals, processions, periodic fasting, the construction of new shrines, can be read as community therapies that manage grief and canalize fear into collective practice. Such rituals can stabilize social relations by creating shared meaning. Consider a community that lost a river to an outburst flood. They mark anniversaries with song and sacrifice, and in doing so they re-establish identity in the face of loss. Mythic narratives, about giants who guided people to safety, or gods who punished hubris, performed the social work of reordering a world that now feels arbitrary and dangerous. Imagine again a narrow valley at dusk, children seated on a flat stone while an elder recounts the night the river rose like a beast. He names the drowned and tells of the small kindnesses that saved others. The narrative is practical and therapeutic. It transmits caution, imparts credit to ancestors for certain practices, and binds the group through shared memory. We still don't know how many of these stories were accurate reports and how many were moralized retellings, but accuracy in the modern sense is beside the point. The tales function to orient people in a changed world. We have wandered through harbors of timber and stone, through river terraces and scoured coulees, across island peat flats and salt flat plazas. We have listened to jars, stones, and bones, and we have heard the soft, insistent return of story. There remains one last arena to probe before we draw our threads together: the scientific frontier where multiple disciplines meet: paleoecology, geophysics, ancient DNA, and linguistics, attempting to knit these local episodes into a pattern without flattening diversity. It is work of exquisite caution and brilliant imagination. In the labs, technicians extract ancient DNA from cave sediments and teeth, reading the echoes of mobility and contact. Geophysicists model meltwater pulses and estimate volumes. Linguists trace loan words for sea and boat that hop across language families, mapping the routes of contact. None of these approaches alone can claim the whole truth, but together they form a wickerwork of provisional knowledge, flexible, porous, and open to revision. They allow us, cautiously, to say more than "we still don't know." They let us propose scenarios with degrees of confidence, each tethered to data and tempered by humility. Picture, if you can, the cumulative effect of all these strands. You stand at an archaeology lab table, watching a technician brush soot from a fragment and whisper its date. You step away to a cliff where wind and gulls judge your smallness. Then you sit in a circle at night hearing an elder's chant about the sea that took the fields. The story is as much about scales, geologic, human, mythic, as it is about water. Water can carve canyons in stone, and shape a child's bedtime story within the same heartbeat. We still don't know, completely, how the great watery disruptions at the dawn of settled life stitched themselves into the broad human narrative. What we do know is humbling and instructive. The past is a room filled with voices, and each fragment we unearth is a speaker. Keep listening. Keep reading the sediment and the stories together. Keep imagining your way into the fog. We still don't know. Now imagine a hollow in the limestone country where groundwater once pooled in a mirror so still that it reflected the sky like a promise. And then, with almost no warning, the ground opened and took the village whole. Picture that sinkhole at the center of a farming valley, a round mouth rimmed with alder and reed, and imagine the sound of chickens and a child's cry swallowed in a single breath. This one line, an ancient karst collapse that swallowed houses, fields, and people, carries a terrible clarity. Some floods are not water from afar but water engineered from beneath, the silent undermining of the earth until the surface gives way. The archaeological context of such sinkhole sites is precise and intimate. Dates derived from charred beams and seeds trapped under men's roofs place occupation in a narrow band roughly between 11,800 and 10,200 years before present. The houses were built of light timber and wattle, clustered near a small freshwater spring whose clear water supported irrigated plots and orchard terraces measured in meters rather than hectares. Measurements of the cavity, now exposed and ringed by fractures, show a diameter that could range from a few dozen to several hundred meters, with vertical walls that plunge down into darkness. Within the collapsed fill, archaeologists find a chaotic tangle of domestic debris, pots, weaving implements, jewelry, and sometimes human remains in positions that suggest sudden entrapment rather than deliberate burial. Soil chemistry around the sinkhole tells of long-term groundwater movement, with soluble limestones slowly dissolved into cavity spaces. Pollen sequences from the infill record the last plants people cultivated, cereal grasses, leguminous seeds, suddenly cut off by a rush of detritus and the influx of subterranean waterlogged sediments. Key discoveries at these sites are the personal details: a string of beads knotted and buried among roof timbers, a child's carved whistle lodged between two stones, a woman's bone all still tucked into a basket, footprints preserved in fine silt on the sinkhole's inner slopes, small, hurried impressions that frame a snapshot of panic. Isotopic analysis of those skeletons often reveals a surprisingly varied diet. Some show inland grain diets, others indicate heavy freshwater fish consumption, suggesting that the site was a point of confluence where upland farmers and valley fisherfolk met in trade and marriage. The mixture of cultural markers, tool styles, pottery tempering techniques, and burial practices points to a community built from multiple strands and therefore socially resilient in many ways, yet unexpectedly vulnerable to the geological whim of a slowly dissolving bedrock. Now we come to competing theories that try to explain how such sinkholes became catastrophic. One model emphasizes natural karst dynamics. Over centuries, a spring drains the limestone soil, creating caves whose roofs gradually thin until collapse becomes inevitable. From this perspective, the sinkhole is a long, slow hazard finally realized in sudden collapse. Evidence for this includes the geological mapping of subterranean voids and the presence of speleothems, stalactites and stalagmites, broken and fallen into the cavity. Another theory suggests that human land use played a subtle but decisive role. Extensive irrigation and the diversion of springs for fields altered the hydrology, increasing the dissolution rate of the limestone and undermining structural integrity more rapidly than natural background rates would predict. This is supported where irrigation channels show accelerated calcite dissolution and where pollen records indicate expansion of agriculture immediately prior to collapse. A third hypothesis raises the specter of climate pulses, a period of extreme wetness that overloaded subterranean drains, forcing higher water tables and hydrostatic pressures that led to sudden collapse. In this reading, the sinkhole is an emergent symptom of a changing climate rather than a singular geological inevitability. Each model holds partial truth when applied to different sites. Sometimes the collapse is purely geological, sometimes a compounded human climatic consequence, and sometimes a terrifying synergy of all three. The mythic and sensational elements attached to sinkholes are immediate and chilling. Many oral traditions record tales of earth that eats, of places where men dared not sleep for fear of being swallowed, or where tombstones are said to sing when the wind moves a certain way. In some regions, stories speak of giants stepping on the ground and leaving circular wounds. In others, the sinkhole becomes the mouth of a subterranean monster that demanded sacrifices. Archaeologists occasionally find burials at the very rims whose rituals, animal bones, bound bundles, votive stones, suggest attempts to propitiate the unseen powers beneath. Are those offerings attempts to placate a deity that once animated subterranean drainage, or pragmatic acts to mark boundaries and warn of danger? The presence of such rites tells us one thing clearly: humans perceived a moral and supernatural dimension to sudden collapse long before geologists had theories about karst hydrology. Picture yourself at the rim as dawn breaks, the hole a black throat edged in frost. The elder of a neighboring village points down and tells you how, on a cold night, the ground sighed and the village fell. You imagine the last moments, lamplight tilting as timbers give, a child clutching the edge of a table, and you feel the ache of enclosing grief. In the collapsed fill you might squint and see the echo of those moments: a pot rim, a heel bone, a matting shard half entombed in silt. We still don't know whether those trapped inside had warning enough to flee, whether they chose to stay to save certain objects of worship, or whether social obligations, care for elders or guards left to protect shrines, meant that some willingly accepted their fate. The ambiguity leaves us with a haunting moral question about how societies distribute risk when the land itself becomes an active agent. There is another, darker hypothesis, one that has attracted the imagination of those who look for single, spectacular agents behind mass death. The idea that not only groundwater but also catastrophic earthquake liquefaction could have produced sinkholes that opened in a matter of minutes. Under strong seismic shaking, unconsolidated sediments can behave like a fluid. Building foundations would lose bearing, and roofs could collapse into newly created depressions. This model fits sites located near known fault systems and where stratigraphy shows seismic disturbance layers. If an earthquake coincided with a heavy precipitation event, the consequences could be particularly devastating. But seismic explanations demand corroborating evidence: tilted tree stumps, offset strata, displaced grave markers, that are absent in many sinkhole contexts, making them compelling in some cases and improbable in others. Again, the lesson is threefold: geological processes are diverse, human choices interact with them, and certainty remains elusive. Beyond the scientific debate, the sinkhole sites offer a compact lens through which to see broader human themes: the limits of engineering, the ethics of risk allocation, and the ways communities ritualize vulnerability. We see the technical knowledge that allowed people to manage springs and fields, we see the social networks that knit together different subsistence strategies, and we see the cultural forms, songs, prohibitions, boundary rituals, that politicians and priests use to regulate behavior. In the sinkhole, the intimate meets the structural. A family's heirloom bead sits beside the cracked remains of a sluice gate, and both speak to the same story of an ecological relationship gone wrong. Those parallels invite us to ask uncomfortable modern questions about groundwater extraction, urban expansion, and the invisible time bombs built into our own landscapes. Picture yourself stepping down into the rim with a light and seeing pottery glinting like fish scales, and imagine for a moment that you could whisper back to the trapped villagers, "We have your pots. We will remember." That sense of moral responsibility shapes much of contemporary archaeology: to recover, to contextualize, and to honor. We still don't know precisely how many such collapses occurred in the early Holocene, nor how widespread their social effects were on migration and cultural transformation. But each site we excavate amplifies the human detail of a period often flattened into climatic indices on a chart. And so, with that final mystery traced, let us pull back and try to see the larger weave. We have walked through harbors reclaimed by sea, river valleys cloaked in silt, lagoon stones placed as if to talk to the moon, coulees carved by the raw force of outburst floods, islands returned to the sea, irrigated plains salted into abandonment, estuarine crossroads choked by changing coasts, and sinkholes that swallowed whole villages. If these episodes at first seem merely local, scattershot, or even unrelated, they begin to cohere when we attend to the patterns of human response: ritualization, engineering, migration, and the creation of narrative that encodes practice. Across these landscapes, one set of themes keeps returning. First, water is not merely a hazard, it is a medium of wealth. Places that manage to turn water into predictable food, through irrigation, tidal fishing, or seasonal scheduling, accumulated surplus, develop social hierarchies, and created the conditions for culture to flourish. Second, systems that deliver abundance often create dependence. Those same canals, sluices, and quays that expand production also create vulnerabilities, single points of failure that, when broken, cascade. Third, catastrophe is rarely monosource. Environmental change, tectonic events, human mismanagement, and social conflict interact in messy, site-specific ways. The neat explanatory narratives we crave. A comet did it, a single tsunami erased civilization, rarely survive contact with sedimentary nuance and the palpable detail of household life. Fourth, myth and ritual are not mere decorations on catastrophe. They are adaptive strategies, mnemonic technologies that enable communities to transmit complex survival knowledge across generations. When a flood myth speaks of a favored family saved by a boat, it is also a compressed manual for building, provisioning, and community coordination. When we look for a single, global cause for the so-called Great Flood 12,000 years ago, we are often misled by the human preference for a master narrative. The archaeological record resists such flattening. Instead, what we see is a period of profound reorganization, a time when the late Pleistocene world remade shorelines and rivers, when humans experimented with new forms of settlement and exchange, when mobility peppered the landscape with genetic and linguistic innovations, and when long-distance networks transmitted both goods and stories. The result is not a single flood but a sequence of environmental shocks and social responses that together create a horizon of instability, a prolonged era in which communities were repeatedly pressured, adapted, migrated, or were extinguished. There is both a tragedy and a lesson in that multiplicity. Tragic because the loss of lives, of local ecological knowledge, of settlements, is often irrecoverable. A single village's artisan knowledge on weaving reeds into rope might disappear with its last craftsperson, leaving future generations to relearn the technique through trial and error. Institutional knowledge fades when its social base dissolves. But there is also a lesson in resilience. New forms emerged, mobile lifeways that could ride floods rather than be overwhelmed by them, maritime calendars that timed harvests to windows of calm, ritual institutions that coordinated labor and redistributed resources. The archetypal image of the flood is one of destruction, yes, but it is also the image of cultural selection, the survival and transmission of practices adapted to watery worlds. Emotionally, these stories put us in touch with a deep human current. Vulnerability and courage are braided together. When a family decided to leave a beloved orchard to wander inland, they were making a decision that balanced immediate pain against uncertain future gain. When a priest ordered offerings at a stone alignment, there was fear and hope in equal measure. When a child clung to a post as water licked the floorboards, the moment encoded both terror and the most ordinary of human acts, holding on to what you love. That moral texture is why these stories endure and why they still speak to us today. As we step back into the present, there is a final, pressing resonance. Our contemporary relationship with water is in many ways a replay of these ancient dramas but on a global and technologically complex scale. Sea level rise, groundwater depletion, engineered river channels, and storm surges are the modern permutations of those ancient processes. We have more tools, engineering, forecasting, law, finance, but we also have larger stakes, megacities on coasts, international supply chains, and interdependent infrastructures whose failures cascade far more widely than the loss of a single valley. The archaeological past warns us that dependency without redundancy is perilous, that knowledge loss can be catastrophic, and that narrative matters, that the stories we tell about risk shape how we allocate resources and who we protect. So what do we actually have to hold on to? We have artifacts and sediments and genomes that, taken together, tell an irrefutable truth. The early Holocene was a period of watery transformation that reshaped human societies in durable ways. We do not, and probably never will, have a single, definitive cause for the Great Flood, because the term itself collapses a vast set of local realities into a misleading simplicity. The floods were many, and the causes were a braided river of ice, climate, tectonics, human choice, and the small, painful contingencies of daily life. But out of that complexity come legible lessons: plan for redundancy, preserve local knowledge, build institutions that share risk rather than concentrate it, and take seriously the stories people pass down. They encode survival strategies as much as they encode memory. Finally, after walking these drowned harbors and scoured coulees, these salt-crusted plains and silent sinkholes, let us answer the most human question: why do these mysteries matter to you and me? They matter because they show us what human life looks like when the ground beneath weaves in and out of safety. They offer models of ingenuity, raised houses, ritual caches, maritime calendars, that can inspire modern adaptation. They offer moral cautions about inequality and the social costs of risk. And they offer, above all, a reminder of kinship across time. The people who watched the river climb are not strange ancestors but our predecessors in adaptation, and their responses are paths we might still walk. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.